Finland wasn't just some place where I got my bachelor's degree, it was where I grew. Figuring things out, finding peace, and finding out what I could be made of. It was difficult, but beautiful. At some point, the journey was leading me elsewhere, and I chose to follow it. Now you're probably wondering why I left, so let me talk about it. Hi everyone, welcome back. My name's CP if you're new here, and I was an international student in Finland for 3.5 years, and I'm kind of filming this video to answer the question regarding why I left. A lot of people subscribed to my channel around a time when I was studying in Finland and I was, vlogging that part of my life. It was a very big part of my life, of course, but I ended up leaving after my bachelor's studies, and I kind of wanted to just discuss that. It just kind of feels wrong to, film all these vlogs about my life here in New Zealand and not really address why I left Finland in the first place and what kind of prompted me to move here in some ways. But also, I just wanted to preface this video by saying that I only have love for Finland. Honestly, I'm really thankful to the country for giving me that experience and, teaching me so many things. And there were so many, stark contrasts that I faced in Finland that really showed me how vast the world can feel. So I was really thankful about that, and the education that I got was really nice. I learned a lot about life and the philosophies that I kind of wanted to go forward with, and I learned how to relax after being in an environment that was very stressful and very competitive. So all the people that I've met there I really cherish, and I really do miss them. There's a special place in my heart for them. This video is more about a few of the things that are not so big, or they have to do with my personal preferences that I had and my perceptions regarding university or regarding my studies. Some of them are very real struggles as an international student that kind of need to be addressed in some way, shape or form. But I'm not saying that Finland is a horrible country and you shouldn't go study there, but this is rather a video to kind of tell you about things that made me not stay there, and maybe you might want to think about if you're considering going somewhere to study, not necessarily just Finland, but just anywhere in the world, what you might want to think about, and the little things that people don't really talk about when going abroad for university. I just wanted to clarify, there's absolutely no slandering. I really treasure my time in Finland, so yeah, but now I'm gonna get on with the video. I have basically all the points written on my iPad because I wanted to take notes and kind of collect my thoughts together. There's a possibility that I haven't thought about everything, and I kind of filmed this video on such short notice, but this is the best I could do in terms of all the ideas I wanted to bring up. First point I wanted to bring up was the campus life. These ideas were definitely reinforced when I went on exchange for a semester in South Korea. I just felt I realized how important campus life was for me. My perception around university was really formed by my parents, and obviously the media that I was consuming, and quite frankly it was just very American, which is a bit of a shame in some ways because I think it definitely limited my openness to different ideas around university and stuff. And I'm very well aware that university is very different depending on where you are in the world, but I just was really looking forward to that, spending a lot of time on campus or living on campus. Actually, that wasn't even a requirement, just that the campus was very active and there was a lot going on. And I just didn't really feel like that was the case. I felt most of my days were just me going there, watching the lecture and then leaving. It was just not really anything for me to stay for, except for when I'd go, to the guild room, and maybe talk to people that were studying in my degree program. And if you guys are watching, the people from that guild room, I really love you guys. I really miss those chats, not gonna lie. But yeah, that was pretty much all I had to do. And quite frankly, the campus just wasn't that big, and probably because people just don't feel like they need to spend much time on campus. I mean, I completely understand, and I think the sentiment around university in Finland is very different. Also, the sun just disappeared again. It's getting quite cloudy. It was a bit boring for me and not very engaging, and it was quite unfortunate. So that was the first thing that made me notice okay, this is really not a fit for me. And of course, I'm not saying that there's nothing going on in Finnish universities, because there is a lot going on throughout the year, but most of it happens off campus, or it is generally just very far, or generally it's just off campus, and in very different places. The campus is not the center for your student life in a lot of ways. At least that's what I got off of my experience. But I think it also has to do with the fact that I was an international student. I think that if you're a Finnish student, the experience tends to be a bit different. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's just how I perceived things while I was there. Now I have my iced coffee, so and kind of talk about things, let's say, with a little more enthusiasm. No, I'm kidding. I don't really need caffeine for that. But the second point I wanted to bring up was diversity. And I know that it's a very privileged take. You know, I'm very well aware of that. And that was made very apparent to me in Finland. But my upbringing was that I never really mentioned this on my YouTube channel. I've never really directly talked about it, but I did grow up in an international school, and basically all of my school life was in an international school. And I'm very lucky to have done that. Like, I, was around people of all sorts of backgrounds, families of all sorts of cultural identities and ethnic identities, and it was like such a beautiful experience, and it's something that I realized I value a lot because, that was constantly being celebrated throughout my school life. People would prepare food from their cultural, cuisines and stuff, and then, bring it over, and then like everybody would have this big feast, like this big potluck. And I really valued that. I really valued this kind of like sentiment regarding that cultural diversity, but also just diversity in general. I appreciated that, people have different insights towards things, different views that are influenced by their cultures or their backgrounds. And that just wasn't really something that I felt was a thing in Finland. And, it's understandable. The country is quite homogenous, and there's nothing really wrong with that. It's just that, unfortunately, I really value those things, and it's just really important to me. So the country being homogenous just turned out not to be a fit for me, and it is just what it is. And I know a lot of people are gonna say that if I moved to Helsinki, maybe it would be, a bit of a change. Maybe I would kind of have a different perspective, but I really don't agree with that. Actually, I spent a lot of time between Helsinki and Tampere. These two cities, they're just not very hard to get to by train. I just would have valued like different perspectives and different ideas, and I just felt like I wasn't really getting any of that, and I didn't feel very enriched by the lack of difference, if that makes any sense. Maybe it could be said that like my outreach, or I was just unlucky in terms of like the people that I was meeting. That could also be the case. I mean, there's 5 million people-ish in Finland. I can't really generalize, right? But based off of my personal experience, this is just what turned out to happen. And, in terms of like the food and, cultural experiences that I could have in Finland, it just wasn't much. And it wasn't something that was celebrated as such, the way that I grew up. And so that was kind of a bummer for me personally. And I feel like other places would just have fit more. I'm very lucky to live in Auckland, a very culturally diverse city. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot to be celebrated. There's so many differences to be recognized and, celebrated, as I said. So that's just like super, super important for me. And it's unfortunate, but it's just a matter of circumstance, The food scene in Finland is just a bit premature. There are so many pioneers in the food and hospitality industry that are like, putting things forward and like really innovating the industry. I've seen it with my own eyes. But, it's still at its start, and I'm just not willing to wait a few years for that to develop. Like, I wanted to move to a city that already has that established, if that makes any sense. Okay, now I'm in the kitchen. The third point I wanted to bring up was actually the weather. A lot of people talk about the weather when it comes to Finland. I go on Instagram, I go on YouTube, and I watch people's vlogs, and they always talk about how grim, dark, and bare the Finnish winters are. And that's true. Like, honestly, that was like so real. And there's no sunlight for like most of the winter. You're kind of just dealing with more than half of your day in complete total darkness, other than the street lights. That actually wasn't as important as I thought. I personally didn't really take vitamin D pills because I wasn't really actually being affected by the winter as much as I thought. And that might also be because I'm already vitamin D deficient. Now that's another story, but people who have grown up in the Middle East, since I grew up in the Middle East, tend to have vitamin D deficiencies, or kind of are used to that because we tend to avoid the sun. The sun is very, it's very blaring, it's very strong, and it's very hot. So we spend most of our time indoors, moving from air conditioning to air conditioning, and that's kind of just what it is. It was just kind of annoying to have that icy weather, to spend a little extra time to walk to the grocery store or walk to my campus. It would kind of almost double the time that it takes to get there, and there's just not really much I can do about that, but it was just really annoying. But the weather is just not really that big of a deal for me. I definitely do prefer sunny weather and like clearer skies and whatnot, but yeah, it just wasn't really that important the way other people might talk about it, but it was something I did think about. For some reason, the weather is getting worse, but I'm not gonna let that stop me from filming this video. Another thing that kind of prompted me to leave was the prices. Now, New Zealand is expensive. Auckland especially is expensive. Like, given any New Zealand city is going to be really expensive, I'm not going to deny that, but you know, the difference that I've noticed is that I definitely get more of a bang for my buck over here. Like, I get more of my money's worth from living here, basically. I don't know if that makes any sense, but generally the quality of services, for example, is just not very good. You know, you pay like a very hefty amount in general for basically anything. The quality is just not very good. The food, for example, when I go out to a restaurant, I know it sounds very superficial of me to talk about, and it's completely valid if someone wants to say that, but the restaurants, for example, you pay like 15, 20 euros, basically upwards of 15 euros these days, and the food would be absolutely subpar. The ingredients are not very good. Like, the quality of food, especially with recent, you know, economic situations, has just gotten much worse, and prices have just gone up, and it's just like not worth it. Like, you know, we're talking like 30 to 40 New Zealand dollars for a single plate or bowl of food, probably even more in certain establishments. So it's kind of getting to a point, and as someone who really loves food and also really loves, you know, coffee, for example, cafes, you pay like 6 euros, like 7 euros, let's say, like that's around 12, 14 New Zealand dollars for an iced latte, only for it to turn out to be really watery and for the espresso to be extremely weak, have absolutely nothing to it. Like, you know, it tastes extremely hollow. It's just that I think the bar for certain things is a bit low, but the prices are so high. I'm an Asian person. I obviously cook Asian food very often, and that's also really expensive. Now, I'm not expecting that it won't be, because you have to import these ingredients. You know, most of these products are made, you know, in Asia, and exported to European countries, other countries around the world, basically. And, you know, of course, there's going to be extra costs for that. But I can't ignore that, despite it being logical, it makes sense. I can't ignore that it is expensive. Also considering, like, the quality of meat and the quality of vegetables in local grocery stores, it's just, it tastes very subpar for me. And I just can't sit with that. And I really struggled with it. And yeah, so I know it sounds really superficial, but it is also one of the reasons I ended up leaving. It's not something a lot of people talk about, but it is a huge deal for me. Also, you know, Finland is not an optimal environment for agriculture and farming. I completely get that, and that's so logical, but even despite it making sense, it just feels horrible for me. I can't really get over that. I'm really sorry I have to say it, but yeah, it is what it is. Another thing that personally really bothered me was my experience with kind of the society, so kind of the people, but I'm not saying that like people were the reason I left, because if anything, my experiences and interactions with Finnish people were really positive, and you know, I really appreciated how honest and genuine people are over there and how direct they are. There's no fibbing, there's no dilly-dallying, beating around the bush. If people want to befriend you, they will befriend you, and you know, of course it can be hard to make friends if you don't have that outreach, if you also have that language barrier, it can be hard to make friends. With regards to like society, yeah, people just don't tend to talk to each other, but you know, I was really introverted before going to university, so for me that wasn't really much of a problem. But where I found a problem with how society worked was that kind of like was a bit of a double-edged sword. I noticed that when I'd be waiting at like bus stops or tram stops, there would be certain people that would be in very vulnerable situations. You know, some weird person might be like catcalling someone or saying really disturbing things, and like, you know, kind of like verbal harassment sorts of things, and nobody would be inclined to even acknowledge that it's happening. Like, people would kind of just act, or like not bat an eye, kind of look the other way and act like it never happened, which was really disturbing for me, because I had to kind of reflect on my experience as a, you know, as a minority, as an international person. And if I was ever in those kind of situations, I would want someone to stand up for me. I would want to also stand up for that person. Many times where I felt inclined to do so, but the way that society kind of feels conditioned to act is that, you know, it's just to stay silent, like act like it's not happening. And that just really disturbed me and really made me think about my place in Finland as a foreigner and what that means if I was to ever be in that situation. And yeah, it was just really disturbing to see, and that was like one of the reasons I just did not want to stay. I didn't want to have to deal with that. I didn't want the possibility of like being left alone even in like the most vulnerable moments out in public, if that makes any sense. I don't know if I'm wording this correctly, but I hope you get what I mean. So the sixth point I wanted to talk about was university. So obviously like university was a huge thing, like a huge part of my life in Finland. It was the main reason I moved there for my bachelor's degree. I just wanted to say that everybody's experience is very different, but also, you know, the gap between Finnish students and international students is like very different. So I want to make that very clear, and this is my experience as an international student in their bachelor's degree, because there's also a difference for people in their master's degree. So, you know, I can't speak for everyone, like I've said before, but the main thing that I've noticed is that there's just a lack of support for international students, especially if you're in your bachelor's degree. That just naturally happens when you have less staffing. There's just less space for you on campus, and that's like totally understandable because there's just not that many of us. Totally get it. It just can't be ignored that that was the case. There were times where I felt like my studies were kind of at a bit of jeopardy because there just wasn't adequate support or adequate help within the course support system, if that makes any sense. And I've heard that in the Finnish counterparts of the same courses that we're taking, there would be so much more help available and so many more resources that the professors would be providing. And I understand that this is also because international degree programs, or rather English-speaking programs in Finland, are a very novel concept. They're not something that has been around for a very long time. Like, we're speaking only in the last decade had they started becoming something. You know, obviously with these new things, I can understand that, you know, the systems are still being refined. People are still trying to figure out how in the world this is supposed to work and how, you know, to bridge the gap between international and local students within the same field and stuff like that. But, you know, obviously my experience is that there were times where I just didn't have that support that I needed, and I felt like, you know, that potential with regards to studying was sometimes tarnished. So, and the style of learning, you know, with regards to hyper independence in some way, I understand that in university you're obviously supposed to take charge of your own learning in like some shape or form, depending on where in the world you are. But personally, I just found that I wasn't really up for that kind of thing where there was like this vagueness in the lectures, and you'd go on to exams and the content would be so much more detailed, or the content rather that you'd be asked about was so much more detailed, and so many more applications that just aren't really discussed, because they kind of just give you the general concepts and you're supposed to kind of like elaborate on that during your own studies outside of university. That kind of style of learning wasn't really for me, and I also really noticed this when I went to Korea on my exchange semester, and I realized that they were a lot more detailed during the lecture sessions, and, you know, there was just a lot of support, because I think people put a lot of importance into really understanding everything at that time in the campus, like no room kind of left for questions almost, which I think is just more my style of learning. So it's just unfortunate that that wasn't for me. But, you know, if you're really into that, if you're really like curious and you don't really want to rely on other people to give you that knowledge, or rather you don't want to be fed everything and you want that curiosity to take charge with regards to what's within you, then I think that, you know, Finland is a really good choice for you, but that just wasn't the case for me. Also, in some regards, the program, especially the one that I was in, obviously I have heard also other things from other students and other programs within my university. I can't speak for others, but the degree program just felt a bit messy. It just didn't feel like it was very well coordinated. Sometimes it felt like the courses that you were taking had no particular purpose, especially in the scope of your major or in your studies that you intend to go on. The degree, for some reason, wanted to have this generalized scope in the first year, and that just wasn't for me. I really wanted to understand what I was aiming to study towards right away, and, you know, this might be just degree program specific, but at least within my university, I felt like it just wasn't that well coordinated. And obviously with the exacerbation of the idea that the international student support is quite low, then you also will kind of struggle even more. So that was a huge problem for me. but time will pass and these issues will definitely not be as bad as they used to be, because like I said, you know, English speaking degrees are really new, and you know, Rome wasn't built in a day, so you know, these kind of things just need time to get better and better. And another thing I also wanted to talk about was that the gap in terms of like the social aspect between international students and Finnish students is really big. Like, some events are just not marketed to you if you're an international student, and I personally was okay with that, but you'll notice that it does mean that you just can't meet that many people. Your university life won't be as active, and I think that goes on to my first point, where like, you know, campus life wasn't that active, wasn't that engaging, and that was probably also because, you know, a lot of things just weren't friendly in some ways for international students. And I realized now that, like, you know, recently that there have been efforts to bridge that gap together, and I've noticed that especially in the last few months before I left. But you know, it is still a huge thing, and it's something that you just have to be ready to face. I was very much aware that I would have to face something like that, but it was still a challenge throughout my student life, and it's something that I think a lot of people should be aware. It's not all unicorns and rainbows. So yeah. The seventh and final point I wanted to talk about was the job market. Now, a lot of international students, especially in Finland, like, they seek jobs throughout and after their studies. It's something that they aim towards. At least this is what I hear when I, you know, talk to my peers and stuff like that. And around the time that I was studying, the job market was just really, really bad. You know, looking for an internship, looking for work placement, even just regular part-time work felt like super out of reach, and it was just not something that I could aspire to do. I had to be completely prepared to just not work throughout my degree. It was just a reality I had to accept. So I was personally okay with that. I didn't really mind. I'm very lucky to not have to rely on a part-time job for my studies to go smoothly and things like this, because studying abroad is not easy. It's not a cheap activity to do. I think I've seen recently that Finland's job market, or rather the unemployment rate, had risen to the highest in the EU. And that I've heard, like, recently from, you know, people that are still there, that, you know, the situation is getting better. If you're an international student, you know, there just isn't that kind of trust. You kind of have to prove yourself a bit more, and that's just something that you have to be ready to accept. And I know for a lot of people, they don't really have a second option. If you go abroad, you kind of have to be brave, and you have to, like, be ready to face all the difficulties. But luckily I had a second option, and that's coming back here. So, you know, I'm very lucky to have had that. But yeah, it is something you do have to think about and be prepared to face when you go, you know, abroad, especially to Finland, where the job market is really, really horrible. Obviously, the job market, especially for young people in New Zealand, isn't much better. It's, you know, it's also not very good, but you know, the difference is that I kind of have a safety net to fall back on over here, and that was the biggest reason as to why I came back. All the issues I talked about regarding being an international student were especially exacerbated in the job market. There are articles discussing the fact that if you didn't have a Finnish sounding name, you are much less likely to get an interview, to even get past the first stage of recruitment. So, you know, it's something that you do have to think about. It's something that you have to consider. And I'm not fibbing. I think, like, there were articles discussing this. I might link them or put them over here if you want to, for reference. But it was something that was definitely very demotivating in terms of the job process. I had to be rather complacent about it. When you talk about getting a job and kind of financing your life after your bachelor's degree or your studies, you know, and you do intend on staying long term, you can't just stay. Like, you need to have a commitment, you need to have a purpose. For most people, that commitment comes in the form of a job, and you know, that would have been my avenue to staying in Finland for a bit longer. But unfortunately, the situation just was not good, and I couldn't, you know, expect, or I had to plan in a way that I was not probably gonna get a job right after my studies. And I know it sounds a bit entitled that I might expect that I need that. You know, you'll need to get a job, you'll need to contribute to society. That's something that I did look forward to, but unfortunately it just didn't happen. And it was hard for me to imagine my future as a international past my studies in Finland. So, you know, it kind of sucks, but it is what it is. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in my video, and I don't think there's anything else I wanted to speak about. But before I end the video, I just wanted to say that I really do miss everything in Finland, like, you know, korvapuusti, like the simple things, korvapuusti, loikeitto, salmon soup, and you know, just like sauna and like just the peaceful vibe. Finland taught me a lot of things about leading a more relaxing and like chill down, tone down life, especially the contrast I had from being in such a competitive and stressful environment. I think I learned so much about, you know, what I want to do or what kind of life I wanted to live, and kind of what I want to aspire for. You know, Finland is a country where the systems work in some ways, like it's extremely reliable, it's very safe, and I was very lucky to live in a place where you could kind of just walk around at 3 a.m. and not worry about the jeopardy of your safety and stuff like that. So I had very amazing friends and people that I could go to and interact with, and obviously some people as well who have reached out to me after seeing some of my YouTube videos. I really treasure them and had such amazing interactions with, you know, the lovely people that I've met there. So, you know, I view my experience in Finland as a positive thing overall. There were just unfortunately a few things that just didn't align with my values, my aspirations, and I wanted after my studies and what I needed. So it is what it is. It isn't really a problem with the country. There are ways that places work and people will love that. You know, it really works for them. And unfortunately, that just wasn't the case for me. Finland just wasn't a right fit for me. The lifestyle, you know, the university, and just the overall outlook of the future, it just wasn't, it was just a mismatch. So although that's like really regretful, I don't regret my experience in Finland at all. If anything, you know, I really want to go back and visit all the people that I cherish so dearly and kind of relive all these experiences. Now I'm here, I'm in New Zealand and I'm very happy here as well. You know, I'm very chill and I'm kind of just embracing like this slowness and like not doing anything, reconfiguring things as well, getting my life together. If you're really interested in seeing how that goes, if you're curious as to how that might be or what that looks like, then, you know, please subscribe and, you know, maybe stay tuned, see what's up. But also, I hope this was helpful if you are thinking about, you know, possibly moving to Finland, especially the Nordic countries. Some of these things I'm talking about are kind of applicable to the other Nordic countries as well. But yeah, like I said, I can't speak for everyone. I can't speak for everything that goes on in Finland, but these are just my personal experiences. And yeah, I'm really thankful that you guys listen to them. And I just wanted to say, especially to the audience that kind of came around the time that I was living in Finland, like, thank you for sticking around. And if you don't, that's okay. But I just really value you guys and I'm just so grateful. So thank you for watching and see you guys in the next video. Bye.